The Department of Justice is styled an Roinn Dlí agus Cirt in Irish. Roinn is the equivalent in Irish of department in the English title. An is the equivalent in Irish of de, which is understood to precede department in the English title, that is, the Department of Justice. If Roinn wasn't preceded by an in the title, Roinn without an would have the sense of a department. Dlí is the equivalent in Irish of law in English, which term, of course, does not appear in the English title of the department. Following and here qualifying Roinn, Dlí expresses of law. Therefore, the first part of the Irish name of the Department of Justice is the equivalent of the Department of Law in English. If we look at the legal definition of justice in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, we see indeed that the second core sense of justice in that entry focuses on law. Reference is made in that entry to the administration of law, especially the establishment or determination of rights according to law or equity, and also to fair, just or impartial legal process. Is then the first part of the Irish name of the department, an Roinn Dlí, incorporating that second sense of justice in the Irish name of the department? There is, in fact, an example of justice being translated by Dlí alone in the official Irish translation of the Criminal Procedure Act 1967, where for the purpose of evading justice is translated as condul ón Dlí, literally to go from the law. The opposite of to go from the law, that is, to go to law in the sense of to take legal action, is expressed in French as aller devant la justice. And to take the law into one's own hands is expressed in French as se faire justice. It was noted in both the Dáil and the Seanad in varying years that the Department of Justice had brought forward more legislation than any other department, that it had introduced more bills than any other department. We see from the government's legislation programme for spring 2024 that the Department of Justice is responsible for more legislation for priority publication in this session than any other department, with 5 bills, whereas 1 bill is the norm for most of the other departments. 8 of the 41 acts enacted in 2023, almost 1/5 of the acts enacted, were acts sponsored by the Minister for Justice. Having learned that an Roinn Dlí is the equivalent of the Department of Law, let us return now to the full Irish title of the Department of Justice, an Roinn Dlí agus Cirt, and ask then, what do the final 2 words in that Irish title express? Agus is the equivalent of and in English. So, an Roinn Dlí agus is the equivalent in Irish of the Department of Law and whatever Cirt is the equivalent of in English. We stated earlier that Dlí, which is the equivalent of law, expresses of law in that Irish title, following and qualifying Roinn department as it does. Cirt also follows and qualifies Roinn, and is the form of the Irish word ceart when that word follows and qualifies another word. Ceart is the equivalent in Irish of right in English, so Cirt here expresses of right. An Roinn Dlí agus Cirt, then, the Irish name of the Department of Justice, would translate literally or directly as the Department of Law and of Right, or the Department of Law and Right. The Department of Justice was established under an Act of the Oireachtas enacted 100 years ago this year, the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924. As stated in the long title of that 1924 Act, it is an Act for constituting and defining the Ministers and Departments of State in Éireann or the Irish Free State pursuant to the Constitution, that is, the 1922 Constitution of the Irish Free State. We see in the second part of the schedule to the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924 that the department is styled an Roinn Dlí agus Cirt. The Minister for Justice is styled an Tara Dlí agus Cirt in paragraph 3 of section 1 of that Act, which section is entitled Establishment of the Departments of State. The name Minister for Justice replaced the name Minister for Home Affairs under that 1924 Act, with the Department of Home Affairs becoming the Department of Justice. When the Ministers and Secretaries Bill 1923 was introduced on the 10th of October 1923, the Minister was being styled An Tara Dlí agus Cirt. The preposition has the sense of about or concerning, and was used regularly in translating official titles in Irish to avoid changing the form of the Irish word when it followed and qualified another word. Had been used here to avoid having to use the form Cirt instead of Cart, and the H is added to both Dlí and Cart after By an amendment moved by Attorney General Hugh Kennedy at committee stage of the bill in February 1924, the was deleted, and Dlí agus Cirt was substituted for Dlí agus Ceart. By that amendment, An Tara Dlí agus Ceart in the Ministers and Secretaries Bill 1923 as introduced became An Tara Dlí agus Cirt in the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924. We see how that same form Cirt is implied in the name of the department, qualifying in that case Roinn or department in the same way as it qualifies Ara in the name of the minister. The equivalent of justice then in the Irish name of the Department of Justice is both Dlí and the genitive form of the word Cart, Cirt. Cart alone, however, without being accompanied by Dlí, was being employed to translate justice in official Irish translations of legislation since the foundation of the Irish Free State in 1922. In the Irish version of the 1922 Constitution of the Irish Free State, justice is translated simply as Cart, without the accompanying Dlí. That Irish Constitution, which forms the schedule to the very first Act passed, is the source of many of the official Irish terms in use in Acts of the Oireachtas ever since. Looking at translations in Acts of the Oireachtas for 1923, in Section 122 of the Defence Forces Temporary Provisions Act 1923, for example, to obtain justice is translated as Con Ceart d'Oil. And we again find justice translated as Cart in the next section of that Act, in translating the justice of the complaint. We even have a translation of ministers of justice in another section of that same 1923 Act, with ministers in this case not referring to government ministers, but we see again how of justice is translated there simply by the same form of Cart, that is Cirt, that we find in the Irish name of the Department of Justice and the Minister for Justice. Again, in Section 12 of the schedule to the very first Act of 1924, for example, that is, the Public Safety Powers of Arrest and Detention Act 1924, of justice is translated as Cirt. Note finally that in the Act which was passed immediately after that Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924 was passed, the adjective just is translated by the adjective Cart. The noun Cart is given as the translation of justice in a typescript entitled The Oireachtas Dictionary of Official Terms from the mid-1930s, which typescript is based on official translations, principally of legislation, done by the translation section of the Houses of the Oireachtas, Rannog and Astracoin in the decade or so following the foundation of the state. Justice is given immediately following right for the headword Cart, written in the Gaelic script in the 1927 edition of the renowned Irish-English dictionary compiled and edited by the Reverend Patrick Deneen. For Denham Carta in that dictionary we have I see that justice is done to, and for the poetic phrase do láthair Cirt we find in the presence of justice before the court. In the standard modern Irish-English dictionary of today, the 1977 Irish-English dictionary edited by Neil O'Donnell, under the headword Cart, if there is justice in the world, or if one might expect justice, is given for má tá ceart le fáil, and the phrase I láthair an Cirt is expressed in English as where justice is meted out, or in a court of justice. For an ceart a cheasamh do dhuine we find to see justice done to someone, and for the rare Cirt we find in accordance with justice. There are examples in the Irish version of the Bible published in 1981 where Cirt corresponds to justice in English versions of the Bible, corresponding to do justice to the humble and the poor in Psalm 81:3 in the King James's version of the Bible, for example. We find Déanaigi Cirt don Dalamh agus don Dearóil in the corresponding psalm in that 1981 Irish version of the Bible. If we return to the legal definition of justice in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, we see that the first core sense of justice in that entry focuses on the adjective just, that is, the quality of being just, impartial or fair, and the principle or ideal of just dealing. We saw earlier on that the second core sense focused on law, that is, the administration of law, especially the establishment or determination of rights according to law or equity, and fair, just or impartial legal process. In incorporating both Dlí and Cirt in the Irish name of the department are those two senses of justice, that is, Dlí, law, expressing the administration of law, and Cirt, literally right, expressing justice in the sense of the quality of being just, impartial or fair, are both those senses of justice being incorporated in the Irish title of the department, on Roinn Dlí agus Cirt. As stated in the Oxford Dictionary of Law, justice is not synonymous with law. It is possible for a law to be called unjust. In Black's Law Dictionary, where we are informed that the English word law goes back before the 12th century, the principal sense of the word law is given there as the regime that orders human activities and relations through systematic application of the force of politically organized society or through social pressure backed by force in such a society. In that dictionary, the principal sense of the word justice, which dates only from the 17th century, is given as the fair and proper administration of laws. So, if Cirt alone was regarded as expressing justice in 1924, when the Department of Justice was established, in being styled an Roinn Dlí agus Cirt in Irish, did this express the Department of Law and Justice? We may note that there is a Ministry of Law and Justice in India still today, dating back to 1833, when the Charter Act of that year was enacted by the British Parliament. There is also a Ministry of Law and Justice in Pakistan. And Nepal has a Ministry of Law, Justice and Parliamentary Affairs. In fact, it is provided in paragraph 3 of section 1 of the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924, in which paragraph, as we saw earlier on, the minister is styled an Tara Dlí agus Cirt, that public services in connection with law and justice, in that order, are the first two of the public services, the administration and business generally of which the Department of Justice is to comprise of. The translation of law and justice respectively in that paragraph 3 is the source of Dlí and Cirt in both the Irish title of the minister and the Irish title of the department. The Irish title of the department incorporates the first and second of the public services, the administration and business generally of which the Department of Justice is to comprise of, as against the English title of the department, which incorporates the second one of those services. How did it come about that justice is given as the second function of the Department of Justice, with law preceding justice as its first function in the Act setting up the Department of Justice? As previously stated, prior to being styled the Minister for Justice by that 1924 Act, the Minister was styled the Minister for Home Affairs, and when the bill was being drafted, the Minister, the functions of whose department are described in paragraph 3 of section 1, was not yet styled the Minister for Justice, but was styled the Minister for Home Affairs. We have a typed draft of the Ministry's Bill as it is styled, dating from the 28th of December 1922, which in section 10 provides for the establishment of a Ministry of Home Affairs. The duties of that minister are provided for in section 12. and the second schedule to that draft bill lists the bodies under the Ministry of Home Affairs. In Section 12 of this draft bill, as in the final version of the bill, that is, in the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924, law precedes justice in what are here listed as the functions of the Minister for Home Affairs. This draft was drafted by the parliamentary draftsman Arthur Matheson, photographed here in later years. In an accompanying memorandum, he states that those provisions allotting to each minister his duties and sphere of action are mainly based on the schedule to the Provisional Government Transfer of Functions Order 1922. We see in that schedule, published in Irishifigoil, or the Official Gazette, on the 4th of April 1922, that the functions assigned to the Ministry of Home Affairs in that transfer of functions commence with the administration of services in connection with law, followed by justice, as in the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924, as regards the functions of the Minister for Justice. And we also see in the Irish version of that notice, published in April 1922, that law and justice is translated as Dlí and Cirt, respectively, as in the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924. In a draft of that notice, a Ministry of Home Affairs and Justice under Eamon Duggan is mentioned, with that ministry having both a Department of Home Affairs and a Department of Justice. A Ministry of Justice was anticipated, however, when the first draft of the Ministry's Bill was circulated, as we see from Section 4 of this memo from the Law Officer, later styled Attorney General Hugh Kennedy, forwarding that draft from Arthur Matheson to the President of the Executive Council or Cabinet. We have in the Hugh Kennedy papers in the UCD archives 2 pages giving various options for the Irish version of the title of the various ministers. Those options were, no doubt, requested from the translation section of the Houses of the Oireachtas, Rannog and Astrucoin. Note the various options given for the Minister for Justice in Irish. The first one, Ara an Dlí agus Cirt. The second one, An Tara Dlí agus Cirt. And the third one, which was the one chosen, An Tara Dlí agus Cirt. That option, where the word following Ara, Minister, and Roinn, Department, directly qualifying that word before it, and therefore changing form in some cases, as we saw Cirt changing to Cirt, that was the option chosen for all of the titles. That was preferred to the option of a preposition following Ara, Minister, and Roinn, Department, as in the case of the earlier second option, and the fourth option, An Tara Re or Le Dlí agus Cirt, in the case of the Department of Justice and Minister for Justice. Note how the translation section, Rannog and Astrucoin, also offered the direct translations of the Minister for Justice, which translations would not include Dlí in the title. These are Ara an Cirt, An Tara Cirt, An Tara Cirt, agus An Tara Re or An Tara Le Cirt. Note in particular how An Tara Cirt was crossed out. The question now arises in concluding who might have had both the authority to style the minister and the department in Irish otherwise than directly translating the English titles, and also the competency in Irish or such an appreciation of Irish as to do so. It was stated in the debate in the Dáil on the second stage of the bill on the 16th of November 1923 that the alteration from the Ministry for Home Affairs to the Ministry of Justice being provided for in the bill was being made at the request of the Department of Home Affairs itself. Henry O'Friel, or Henry O'Friel, became Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs in September 1922. O'Friel from Donegal had entered public life in 1920 and was chairman of Dublin County Council in 1920 to 1921. O'Friel was one of the members of the small committee appointed to examine the allocation of functions among government departments, to review all state services with a view to a regrouping of departments under the various ministries, which regrouping was in due course implemented through the Ministers and Secretaries Act 1924. Note that in November 1921, O'Friel wrote the foreword to the Handbook of Irish Terms for the Use of Public Bodies, published that year by the Irish County Council's General Council, and in early 1922 he represented that General Council in consultations relating to the teaching of Irish in schools. It is recorded that Henry O'Friel was able to read and write Irish well, as we see in this table from a Department of Justice file containing a response to a circular dated the 22nd of January 1926 regarding officers with knowledge of the Irish language. And in his foreword to the Handbook of Irish Terms for the Use of Public Bodies, O'Friel states that care should be taken in building up composite phrases from the terms in the handbook, and that the only safe course in those matters was to consult local Irish scholars. Henry O'Friel, therefore, would have had both the authority and the knowledge or appreciation of Irish that would have facilitated his being instrumental in having the Department of Justice styled on Roinn Dlí agus Cirt in Irish, rather than implying a direct translation of the Department of Justice.